Hello, my name is Adrian Goldberg and welcome to the Byline Times podcast. The Byline Times is what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report and what telly doesn't tell you. This time, the small matter of capitalism, corporate crimes, backdoor bailouts and the death of freedom. That's the title of Grace Blakeley's new book. I've read it and I can recommend it. And that's not just entirely because Grace Blakeley is sitting opposite me. It is a work full of energy and big ideas. It challenges, it provokes, and if you buy into its central thesis, it offers hope as well. Grace, welcome. I want to talk right at the top of this about capitalism, because the supporters of capitalism would argue that, of course, like any system, it has its flaws, but it has proved to be the most effective engine yet developed for delivering more wealth to more people than anything else in human history. How do you respond to that?
Firstly, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It's great to be here and thank you for that introduction. So in response to that question, I come from basically a Marxist perspective, and I know that that sounds a bit kind of scary to a lot of people, but all it is a particular way of analysing and understanding capitalism. And what Marx wrote about this particular question is actually that you're right. Capitalism does create the foundations for an economy that can produce wealth of a kind that has never really been seen in human history. It kind of concentrates energy and resources into innovation, into the development of new ideas, and brings us interesting and fantastic new technologies that would obviously never have been developed under the systems that preceded it, systems like feudalism. But Marx argues that the problem with capitalism is the way that we produce things creates inherent contradictions and problems that ultimately make the system unsustainable in the long term. What I mean when I say the way that we produce things, I'm talking about the social division of labour. Now, what does that mean? It effectively is about how we live in a society where a small number of people own all the things that we need to produce things and make all the decisions as to how those resources are used, whilst everyone else is forced to work for a living, basically is forced to work for these people who are basically in charge of our whole society and our economy. Now, that creates a lot of different problems. It creates problems of inequality. It creates problems of climate breakdown, because those at the top obviously just want to use their resources endlessly to create endless amounts of wealth for themselves. But the problem that I focus on in particular in this book is the question of freedom. Now, when you live in an economy in which power is so concentrated in a small number of hands, most people feel, rightly or wrongly, very disempowered. They feel that they don't have the power to take decisions over the major matters that affect their lives. Because, they go to work, they're told what to do by a boss, they're kind of wandering along the streets and they're pushed around by representatives of the state. They go into the voting booth and they get to choose between two political parties that basically offer them similar sorts of things. And over time, and I think as we're seeing now, people really start to get quite angry about that sense of powerlessness and the kind of the lack of freedom that you get in a capitalist society. And this was something that in the 1980s, for example, we were told politicians like Thatcher and Reagan came in and they said, we're all about freedom. We want to give you more freedom, more free markets and all that sort of stuff. And what I'm trying to do in the book is really take apart those arguments, those kind of, what we would call neoliberal arguments about how capitalism and freedom and democracy all go hand in hand, and show actually that capitalism is a system based on monopoly and oligarchy.
One of the most intriguing insights for me in the book was that you talk about central planning. Now, those of us of a certain age will remember that in the old Soviet Union, there was much talk of central planning, but you argue that central planning is actually intrinsic to late stage capitalism, and that central planning is the province of big corporations sanctioned by government.
Yeah, exactly. What is central planning of the economy? It's effectively when decisions are made about production based on the authority of a couple of people rather than what the market is telling everyone to do. I go through in the book lots and lots of examples as to when this happens, but you see it all the time. For example, when governments decide we're going to spend billions of dollars bailing out the banks that have just caused the financial crisis, or bailing out corporations in the middle of the pandemic. Or you see it when you get massive monopolistic corporations, often that actually initially don't make profits. So the market is telling them do something else. And they're saying, no, we want to carry on building this empire and expanding our market share in order to basically build our political power and our ability to kind of plan what goes on in the market and tell people what to do. So this idea that socialism is state central planning and capitalism is free markets is just completely wrong. It gets the terms of the debate totally mixed up. Because within capitalist societies, you see central planning by the state. Yes, states, broadly speaking, have a lot of control over the economy. And you also get this kind of central planning by big corporations that undermines the functioning of this free market. Now, if you go back to the history of capitalism and of liberalism, which is the kind of major philosophical ideological tradition that a lot of defenders of capitalism wrote from, they would say that the market is the only way to kind of guarantee human freedom. So we don't want the overbearing hand of the state telling everyone what to do. We want everyone to be able to produce the things they want and consume the things they want in this nice market of commodities and ideas and all these sorts of things. And that's always been the defense of capitalism. It's been that it promotes freedom through the market. Now, there's a lot of problems with that argument in itself, but what I argue in this book is that it doesn't apply to reality because capitalism is not a free market system. So all of those arguments that were made for the adoption and protection of capitalist systems based on the fact that anything else would lead to tyranny, they fail to understand the fact that we already have tyranny. We already have these massive corporate entities telling everyone what to do, these unaccountable bosses that can basically do whatever they want. I look in the book at the example of Boeing, which is this huge aerospace company. It's basically in a kind of monopolistic industry. It only has one major rival. And many listeners will have seen that Boeing's been in the news a lot recently, firstly because a door blew off a plane mid-flight. But before that, a few years ago, people might remember that a couple of Boeing planes literally nosedived out of the sky. And it was later revealed that Boeing senior executives had known about the flaws in the plane that led it to nosedive out of the sky, but did nothing about it and actually tried to cover up the problems before it went to market to safeguard their own profits. So this kind of sounds like a classic example of the failure of the free market, right? It's corporation putting profits before people's lives. But what's particularly interesting about the Boeing story is, firstly, it's not in a real market. It's in this duopolistic market structure. And secondly, the role of the American state is massive. Boeing is the biggest recipient of corporate welfare. I think it was in 2018. And the FAA, the regulator, basically allowed the company to regulate itself. It was being regulated by a unit within Boeing whose employees were paid by Boeing. And this was all allowed to happen by the state. And then when COVID came around, after all of these horrible crashes, the government said, here's another massive bailout. So, this idea that basically we hear a lot in politics, which is that you can fix the problems of the market with more government, or you can fix the problems of government with more market. It really fails to understand the complex ways in which the public and private sector are basically fused within capitalist economies in service of promoting their own wealth and power.
When you talk about the ways in which personal relationships matter in this regard as well, you give the example of the office rental company WeWork, and by any measure, WeWork should have gone under. But the personal relationship between the founder of WeWork and SoftBank, which was so invested in this company, ensured that WeWork survived despite the most horrendous losses.
Yeah, and now it's, I think, gone into bankruptcy, if not on the verge of bankruptcy, right? And this was something that would have been very obvious from the very beginnings of the whole WeWork saga, which was basically, it was this company that grew from relatively humble beginnings and just exploded. And, you suddenly saw WeWorks everywhere. And the founder started saying he wanted to develop, we live apartments and we fly planes and build a WeWork on Mars and all this kind of crazy stuff, and managed to get a lot of investment in this idea from people like Masayoshi Son, the founder of SoftBank. And then as the company was about to go public, journalists took a look into the accounts and found that it was basically kind of built on just lies, basically, that the founder, Adam Neumann, had implemented all of these really dodgy practices, like taking out lots of personal loans, and he copyrighted the term we and then sold it back to the organization. It was basically this kind of scheme to allow him to get rich on the back of the relationships that he had with his investors, whether those were banks or people like Masayoshi Son. And when all this terrible corporate governance came out, it looked as though WeWork would collapse. But again, because of the relationships, not because of the market was saying this thing needs to tank, but because of the relationships that Neumann had with people like Masayoshi Son, Son stepped in and said, we're going to save this institution for whatever reason. Obviously, they thought it would be worthwhile over the long run, or he just didn't want to lose all the money that he'd put into the company up to that point and didn't want to lose faith and be embarrassed by what had happened with Adam Neumann. And so this company limped on with tons and tons of funding from SoftBank trying to dig itself out of this hole. And then eventually it did go public and, slowly it lost value over time and now is kind of at this point where it's on the verge of bankruptcy. And I suppose what I wanted to show with this story, which is the story that opens up the chapter on finance, is that finance doesn't really operate according to markets either. That it is really the personal links between the heads of big financial institutions, between politicians and bureaucrats within the government, and between chief executives and shareholders within major corporations that determine this really critical question of where financing and funding are allocated within our economy. And, that question of who gets the loans is really, really critical because it determines things like which companies are able to scale, which new technologies are able to be developed, which businesses, which states even thrive and which ones go under. And those decisions are basically made by people. The kind of standard economist would say, oh yes, but if they make the wrong decision, they're punished by the market. But more often than not, because they're able to save themselves using their relationships and the connections that they've been able to build up behind the scenes.
And of course, the banks themselves having made catastrophic errors that led to the collapse in 2008 onwards, and having almost brought the Western world to its knees, those banks were themselves bailed out.
Exactly. People will be familiar with the kind of general story of the bailouts, but I'm not sure they'll be familiar with the kind of horrendous, intricate details of what actually happened. Because in the US, there was this big problem with the insurance company AIG. Now, basically what had happened is that all of these banks had been lending lots and lots of money in mortgages and then packaging these mortgages up into all these kinds of asset-backed securities, basically, kind of products that they could sell to other banks to raise more money. And all these products relied on the idea that mortgages would continue to be issued and that the housing market would continue to boom. But the banks also knew that there was an actual problem there in the sense that what if the housing market did begin to fail? No one actually thought that that would happen, but they thought we'll insure ourselves against that potential eventuality by going to a big insurer and say, can you insure us against the potential that the housing market would collapse? So AIG thought, well, this is a great way for us, a kind of little insurance company, well, a big insurance company, but not as exciting as an investment bank, to make loads of money. So they issued all of these insurance contracts. And then suddenly, when the housing market collapsed, AIG had to pay out insurance on this kind of massive event that no one predicted would happen. And obviously, the firm was on the brink of bankruptcy. Now, if you look at what happened behind the scenes and the conversations that were taking place, the big worry among regulators with regards to AIG was the fact that Goldman Sachs had taken out tons and tons of insurance with AIG because they had some clever analysts, people who've seen The Big Short will know this, who saw ahead of time, oh, maybe the housing market might actually crash. So Goldman Sachs continued to sell all these products, basically saying the housing market won't crash, while taking out loads of insurance, saying the housing market will crash. And then when it did crash, the insurer was going to go under. So they went to the government to say, bail out the insurer so we can get the cash that we need through this insurance deal that we made. And of course, that's exactly what happened. AIG got bailed out. There's a quote that I use, and I think it's from Michael Hudson. It became a massive taxpayer-funded piggy bank to prop up Goldman Sachs, basically to prop up the big investment banks. And it just kind of shows the corruption, really, that's at the heart of this system, because ordinary homeowners were being kicked out of their homes, often illegally, in the US. And obviously lots of people went bankrupt, the whole economy turned. But these bankers were protected from the consequences of their actions because the state said, we've got your back.
But one of the most important points that you make, one of your key arguments, is that these are not rogue operators. The fusion of state and major corporation is intrinsic to the way modern capitalism works.
Yeah, for me, this is one of the most important arguments, right? Because there's lots of people who will listen to what I'm saying and say, yeah, you're right, but that's not capitalism, that's crony capitalism, or it's a kind of corruption of the free market. And actually what we need to do is introduce more free markets, not kind of try and transform capitalism. It's just we need real capitalism rather than this inverted commas fake capitalism that we have right now. But I think why it's really important to note that I come from this Marxist perspective is to show that actually this fusion of public and private power is inherent to the way capitalism functions. And this is an argument that's kind of unique to Marxist political theory. Marx himself said the state was nothing but a committee for managing the affairs of the bourgeoisie, right? So basically, the state just exists to do what capitalists tell it to do. I think this is really interesting, given that most people think, oh, leftists all want a big state, whereas actually back in the kind of 1800s, most socialists were looking at states that were just doing what big businesses told them to do and saying, we don't need more state, we need worker power, basically. We need people who are going to resist the operation of the state as well as the operation of big businesses. And yeah, that kind of tradition of Marxist theory blossomed and led to this really interesting development in scholarship about the relationship between states and capitalists, basically. Many people will know Ed Miliband, obviously, the former leader of the Labour Party. His dad, Ralph Miliband, was a famous Marxist scholar who wrote about the capitalist state. And he basically said that it's not the case that you can never win any progressive victories within the state. Of course you can. The state does things for workers. But it only does that when workers are so well organised that politicians have no choice, because the only option is build the NHS or revolution on the streets, right? And Miliband says, as someone who kind of had been very active on the British left and kind of involved in the Labour Party, all the major political parties agree on the kind of foundations of the system. They all agree on the main things that are needed to keep capitalism going and to keep political power in the same set of hands. And the job of the Labour Party in that system is basically to kind of make deals with the workers to make sure that the workers don't threaten the system. And I think that's the kind of insight that leads me into my conclusions about how we change things, which is that you can't just keep putting in new politicians and expecting the whole of society to change. You can't just replace chief executives with women or, meet diversity quotas or whatever and expect corporate governance to change. What we really need is for people to organize and to start threatening the system again. Ordinary people used to be organized enough to be a threat to the establishment and to say, if you don't give us wage increases in line with inflation, then we'll go on strike and you won't make profits anymore. Now that movement has been completely hollowed out by politicians like Thatcher and to a lesser extent even Tony Blair. And ordinary people don't pose a threat to the establishment anymore, really. Now, that is less the case as people kind of come out onto the streets and start making demands. And you can tell that what's going on at the moment with the uptick in protest and the uptick in strike action is threatening to the government because they're trying to outlaw protest and they're trying to outlaw strikes. But we're coming from a very, very low base. And I want to look in the book at how we really start to get ordinary people organised enough so that they scare the people in charge.
And your book is positive, it is optimistic, and it argues strongly for change, for more democracy, essentially, and greater participation in democratic processes throughout society. But later this year, listeners to this podcast, certainly in the UK and indeed in the United States in a different election, but voters will be faced with the option to cast a vote at the ballot box. In light of what you've said about the underpinnings of this system not changing, really, do you think it's worth voting?
I do think it's worth voting. I think the problem with our politics is that voting is seen as the be-all and end-all of politics. When we talk about politics and political power, it's always, well, you want things to change, get out and vote. And that's always the answer that's given to everyone. It's, oh, well, you're too lazy to vote, so you don't deserve to kind of have a say in what's happening anyway. And oftentimes the reason that people aren't going out to vote is because they see that most political parties kind of offering the same things or don't really represent them and don't represent their interests. And I think it's really important for us to recognise that voting is part of politics, but it's a small part of politics, actually. And that what happens in elections, what happens in government, what happens in society over the long term is affected much more by changes in the balance of power in society than it is by changes in governments or individual politicians. So our society looks extremely different today than it did in the 1960s, in some ways for the better and in some ways for the worse. Now, one of the big differences is that in the 1960s, you had this powerful trade union movement that was able to pressure the Labour Party to adopt policies like introducing the NHS, work within the state to try and put pressure on bosses to agree to wage increases, all these different sorts of things. And today, we don't have that whatsoever. And in a lot of cases, the politicians are saying sorts of similar things, but society looks very different. And that's because there are different understandings of what politics is today than there have been in history. People don't see joining a trade union as a political act. Often they don't even see protesting necessarily as a political act. It's kind of like just an act of anger or resistance. They don't see it as connected to politics. And especially things like organising within your community to say, fight against the closure of your local libraries or pressure your council to adopt a different set of strategies or policies when it comes to public services. People don't necessarily see these things as connected with wider political struggles, and they certainly don't really see them as connected with voting or what they're demanding from political parties. But what I'm saying is that we've got the chicken before the egg. So we think, oh, we go to the polls and then we'll elect a government and then the government will change things for us and then things will get better. What I'm saying is you have to actually start to change things yourself in your community, in your workplace, on the streets, in order to get the kinds of political parties that will deliver you the things that you want to see, because it's all about power. And things begin to change in a society when power begins to shift. That's another really critical part of this Marxist analysis.
Is it an Anglo-centric prism through which to view the world? I look at two very different parts of the world that may have different trajectories. So you look at China, for example, an authoritarian state grounded to some extent, at least, in Marxism, but which nevertheless has adopted some of the tenets of what we'd understand to be capitalism. You also then, elsewhere in Europe and Scandinavia, you have social democratic models, which, for example, in the case of Germany, do incorporate worker participation at boardroom level. So I just wonder whether those examples are worth factoring into where we go from here.
Absolutely. And I talk a lot about China. I talk a lot about Germany. I've got loads of examples of different kind of models from all over the world. And I think, again, the question we've got to be asking ourselves here is what comes first? Is it the policy change or is it the power structures? So take Germany as an example. I look at Germany because when the kind of neoliberal era was beginning, when you started to see all these arguments being made about free markets, Germany took a slightly different route. And so the Americans were saying, we're going to let big businesses do whatever they want. And Germany was saying, no, you need protections for competition to make sure that the free market functions. So there were these divergent paths. And part of that was to do with the strength of the German labor movement, and to do with also the kind of pressure that was imposed by being so close to kind of state socialist alternative, where people look at that and say, why don't we have stronger workers and stronger unions and better housing and all these different sorts of things? And for a long time, that kind of divide within global politics, it scared the powerful more, basically. There was this idea that if the workers organised, then they could start to really threaten the status quo. So you started to see more progressive policies being implemented. And for a long time, Germany had this idea of the social market economy. So it's not capitalism, it's not socialism, it's somewhere in between. And yet what's happened as power has shifted, so as German workers have become less powerful and as capital has become more powerful, thanks to globalization, thanks to all of these shifts that we've seen since the 1980s, even Germany has moved closer to this kind of American model, and the whole of the European Union has moved closer to this American model of basically letting corporations get away with murder. So you've seen a real shift in competition policy even at the level of the European Union, which is supposed to be this brilliant enforcer of competitive markets. And actually the vast majority of the merger cases that are brought to European competition authorities, they don't do anything about it. They don't block mergers when they need to. And in Germany now, you've got this massive problem. You've had permanent austerity, basically, for kind of a decade now. And a big part of that has been because it's become a lot harder for German workers to fight back. Now, again, in China, you have this kind of state capitalist model, right, where the state has tons and tons of power over the economy. And that has been set up as a kind of alternative to the, inverted commas, free market capitalist model that we have in, say the US. These are both capitalist economies, by the way. They both have production, a social division of labor in order to produce commodities. In China, there's like tons and tons of billionaires, for example, and there's a fairly big private sector, even if it is very intertwined with the state and the public sector. Although, of course, you can say the same thing about the US. Now, what's interesting about China is even though it's this state capitalist economy, right? So you might think, oh, maybe it's fairer and maybe workers have more power. Workers have very, very little power in the Chinese economy a lot of the time, especially when their interests don't appear to align with the interests of the bureaucrats at the very top. So when workers have tried to organize to, say, fight back against terrible labor conditions, often they've just been crushed, right? So again, these are questions of power, not just of the type of economy that you have, if it's the social market economy or a neoliberal economy or a state capitalist economy. The real question that you have to ask yourself is who has the power in an economy? Now, what all of these economies have in common, what every economy in the world has in common, is that there's a small number of people at the very top, whether they're mainly in the public sector, whether they're mainly in the private sector, who basically get to make decisions on behalf of everyone else. Now, I argue
the capitalists.
Well, the capitalists and also the politicians, right? Because, in China, for example, I kind of say it's a different model, but what it has in common with the West is this massive concentration of power at the top. Now, in China, it's the bureaucrats that have more power than the kind of billionaires and the people in the private sector. But they basically work together to achieve the same ends. Equally, in the US, politicians work together with private executive, big business and representatives of the capitalist class to basically achieve the same sorts of things. So you've got all these people at the top whose interests are kind of aligned. It's that they want things, broadly speaking, to continue as they are, even if they disagree on kind of bits and pieces. The real difference wouldn't be changing from a state capitalist economy to a free market economy or a social market economy. The real difference would be a true democracy. That would be a society in which ordinary people took decisions about the structure of society. So it would be an economy in which workers owned the corporations in which they worked and they worked together to manage and govern those corporations. It would be a society in which local people were active participants in decisions around how their money is spent and how their local community is governed. It would be a society in which citizens were able to hold politicians to account, not just at elections, but all the time through, for example, democratic public services. So service users being able to say, this is how, our health service should be run, alongside the people who are working in it, talking about how they would govern these systems rather than having these hierarchies and managers and politicians all telling everyone else what to do. For me, that's what freedom is. And it's something that we can't have under capitalism because it threatens the power of those at the top.
Most of the street protests in the UK, the US, even in continental Europe in recent years, this is a very broad brush statement, I realise, have come from the right, from the nativist right. Why do you think that is?
I think that we all agree, most average people agree, that the system that we live in is broken. And the big divide is between those who think it can be changed and that things can get better, and those who basically don't think that it can be changed and believe that things cannot get better. And I think the problem with the anger that there is in our society is an anger that comes from people believing that the system is broken, but feeling utterly powerless to change anything. So they look at the corruption that there is at the top. They look at politicians coming to power and nothing changing. They look at their lives getting worse and worse and worse and being unable to really make changes to that model. And they think, firstly, this is my fault. So if you can't put food on the table nowadays, rather than thinking my boss is exploiting me, I need to organize, you think this is my fault. I'm going to go out and take out a payday loan to try and put food on the table. So you internalize the problems with the system as something that is your problem. It's your fault. It's your responsibility. That makes you feel depressed often. And a lot of the time it makes you feel angry, because there is this sense that we've constructed a society in which the same people win over and over and over again, and the same people lose over and over and over again.
But my point is that the people taking to the streets very often don't blame the bosses who you would argue are exploiting them. Their anger is directed towards migrants and others who they perceive to be taking the bread from their mouths.
Exactly. And this is the point I'm trying to get at, which is that the problem is individualism. It's looking at a system, thinking it's broken, and then only being able to blame individuals. So saying it's my fault, or it's an immigrant's fault, or it's a scrounger's fault, or even it's like that one bad chief executive's fault. I think it was Christine Lagarde said, if it had been Lehman Sisters instead of Lehman Brothers, the financial crisis wouldn't have happened. This idea that if you just change individual identities or individual people, or indeed blame individual groups, then everything will change. And I think that is what gives power to the far right. It's like the system is broken and we need someone to blame, because I don't want to feel like it's my fault anymore. I want to blame someone else. And what the left's answer to that, I think, has to be, it's not just to come to people as a political party and say, give us your vote, give us your power, and we'll do good things for you. It's actually to say, the system is broken, but you do have the power to change it if you organise. As an individual isolated person, as a consumer rather than a citizen, or an entrepreneur rather than a worker, you don't have the power to change the system because you are just one individual. Even the most powerful individual in the world doesn't have the capacity to kind of plan the whole economy on their own. The problem is this entire system that we have. And unless we can build people into groups that are able to organise, to challenge the foundations of our economy and our politics, that are able to force politicians to listen to them, then we will continue to see people responding to the brokenness of this system by going to the far right. And the offer of the far right is basically, our economy is broken. You are being screwed over by an elite that are taking all the advantages for themselves and leaving you with very little. And the offer is, we're going to get revenge for you. We're going to burn the system down. We're going to drain the swamp or take down the liberal metropolitan elite, right? The people who look like winners to the people who feel like losers. And again, it's individualism. It's saying, we'll make you feel less bad about yourself in an economy in which you're losing, rather than saying, why don't you organise with the other people who are also in the same position as you, people who can't afford to heat their homes or put food on the table, to hold these politicians to account. And I think the fact that we've lost that sense of collective agency, we've lost the fact that people would resist their exploitation and resist politicians who oppressed them and ignored them. That's why people are so angry, and it's why they're going to the far right.
One final thought. In the course of this interview, you've referred at least twice to Karl Marx and Marxism. Marx has become a name, certainly on the mainstream left, a name that is not invoked, although clearly Marx underpins every left-wing movement in the world.
I would say so.
Is that part of your mission as well, to reclaim Karl Marx and put him there, back at the centre of debate?
My mission is to get people to realise their own political power and to start fighting back against a political class who treats them with disdain. And I think that was also Marx's mission, basically. He also had this wider goal of kind of trying to analyse and understand capitalism. But he was an integral part of the revival, or the kind of building, the formation of the socialist left, that was all about building power in the factories, as it was then, and using that to take on a political class that treated working people with disdain. And in that sense, I do want to revive Marx, not just because that's the person that I identify with in terms of his economic analysis, but because I think we need to realign with a longer term leftist political tradition that is about empowering people.
Grace, thank you so much for your time. Grace Blakeley's book, Vulture Capitalism, Corporate Crimes, Backdoor, Bailouts and the Death of Freedom, is out now on Bloomsbury. My name's Adrian Goldberg and you've been listening to the Byline Times podcast. And just to say, by the way, if you do want to support our work on this podcast, please think about taking out a subscription to the Byline Times. It's our fabulous monthly newspaper. If you take out a subscription, you'll get the best of our online offerings and also exclusive content in the paper that you can't read anywhere else. And you'll also be helping, as I say, to support this podcast too. This has been a We Bring audio production by me, and Harvey White in Birmingham. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again very soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.